The truck backed down the gravel lane, just after 7 in the morning, its bed piled high with hay nobody wanted. The bales were dark at the edges, matted in places, some of them soft enough to sag under their own weight. A second truck followed it, then a third, until the yard beside the old barn looked like a dumping ground instead of a farm. Margaret Doyle stood at the gate in her work boots, clipboard in hand, checking off each load as it arrived. Across the fence line, Wallace Pruitt leaned against his own truck and watched with his arms crossed. "You're paying good money for that," he called out. "Half of it's gone soft. Cattle won't touch it." "I'm not feeding cattle with it," Margaret said, without looking up from her clipboard. Wallace shook his head slowly, the way a man does when he's already decided someone is making a mistake and doesn't feel the need to argue about it further. Nobody standing in that yard that morning understood what Margaret Doyle was building. Not the neighbors leaning on their trucks. Not the men unloading the bales. Not even, fully, Margaret herself. Not yet. Those truckloads didn't come out of nowhere. To understand why she was paying for hay other farmers wanted gone, you have to go back 3 years, to the morning she first knelt down in the dirt behind an old shed and noticed something nobody else had bothered to look at. Margaret was 44 years old, and she had been running the farm alone for 3 years, since her husband Daniel died of a heart attack while checking the fence in the north pasture. She hadn't planned on becoming a farmer by herself. She'd planned on growing old beside him, splitting the work the way they always had. Him in the fields, her with the books and the garden, and the animals closer to the house. Instead, she inherited 210 acres, a mortgage that hadn't gone anywhere, and land that had been worked hard for 2 generations without much given back to it. She kept a small spiral notebook in her jacket pocket, the pages soft from handling, filled with notes in her own shorthand, rainfall totals, which fields drained slowly, where the weeds grew thickest. Every morning before breakfast, she walked at least one section of the property, just to look. Daniel used to tease her about it. She never stopped. The farm's problem wasn't dramatic. Nothing had happened all at once. The south fields, the ones planted in corn and soybeans most seasons, had gone quietly tired. Water sat on the surface after rain instead of soaking in. In July, the ground cracked in long, dry seams. The topsoil that used to be soft and dark under her boots had thinned into something pale and stubborn, more like packed clay than living earth. Yields had crept downward for 3 years straight, and the bank statements had noticed before Margaret let herself admit it out loud. She couldn't afford to truck in commercial compost by the ton, and she couldn't afford another season of watching money go into the ground that gave less back each year. It was Wallace who first found her looking at the fence line behind the old hay shed, kneeling in the grass with her hand pushed into the dirt. "Something wrong?" he asked, more out of habit than real curiosity. "Come look at this," she said. He didn't get down, but he glanced over. Along the base of the shed, where loose hay had blown and piled and rotted for years without anyone touching it, the ground looked different, darker, softer. When Margaret dug her fingers in, the soil came apart easily, threaded with fine white roots and the unmistakable coiled shape of an earthworm. 10 feet away, past the shadow of the shed, the ordinary field soil was pale, dry, and hard as a floor. "Old hay pile," Wallace said, shrugging. "Things rot. The ground gets a little rich, right under it. Doesn't mean anything." Margaret didn't argue with him, but she didn't forget it either. She spent that winter reading whatever she could find. Old extension bulletins from the county office, a couple of worn agricultural texts from the library, notes scribbled by farmers on forums who talked about organic matter and soil structure in ways that finally made her own observations make sense. She talked to a retired county agent named Harold Ness, who told her plainly that hay itself wasn't magic. It was what hay became once it broke down, that mattered, the organic matter it left behind, the way it fed the microbes and worms that did the real work underground. She didn't have a theory yet. She had a question, and she decided to test it. That spring, she made her first real mistake. She spread old hay across a quarter of her worst field, thick, in some places nearly a foot deep, thinking more would mean faster results. She laid it too close to a strip of young oats she'd planted as an experiment. Within 3 weeks, the oats beneath the thickest hay had turned yellow and stunted, choked for light and air, the ground beneath gone slick and airless instead of loose. She lost most of that test strip. Wallace happened to drive by while she was pulling up the ruined seedlings. "Told you," he said, not unkindly, but not gently either. "Hay's not fertilizer, Margaret. It's just hay." She straightened up, wiped her hands on her jeans, and said only, "Guess I put it on wrong." She didn't quit. She went back to her notebook that night and wrote down exactly what she'd done wrong. Too thick, too close to young roots, too wet from the rain the week before. It wasn't the material that had failed. It was her method. The next season, she changed her approach entirely. Instead of dumping hay in heavy piles, she began spreading it in thin layers, only 2 or 3 inches, letting light and air still reach the soil beneath. She stopped laying it directly against tender seedlings, and instead used it around established plants, as a blanket rather than a burial. She started composting some of the worst material first, letting it break down partway before it ever touched the field. She left sections of pasture with living roots in the ground year-round, instead of leaving bare dirt exposed to sun and wind between plantings. Harold Ness, when she described it to him, nodded slowly. "You're not feeding the plant," he told her. "You're feeding what's underneath the plant. Different thing entirely." Progress that first full season was small enough that most people wouldn't have called it progress at all. The soil under the treated strips held moisture a little longer after rain. The ground felt slightly less like concrete when she walked it in August heat. By the second season, the difference had become something she could show someone, not just describe. The soil in the treated sections had darkened, crumbled more easily between her fingers, held together in soft clumps instead of breaking into dust. Earthworms showed up in numbers she hadn't seen on that ground in years. By the third season, the corn in those strips stood noticeably taller than the untreated rows beside it. The leaves a deeper green, the stalks thicker at the base. Then came the setback that nearly finished what money troubles had started. A heat wave settled over the county in late July of that third year. 10 straight days over 100 degrees with no rain in sight. Margaret watched her untreated fields crack open along the same old seams, the corn curling and graying under the sun exactly the way it always had. But this time, she also watched the treated ground. It didn't stay green and lush, nothing could have, in that heat, but it held on longer. The soil beneath the hay-covered rows stayed cool enough, moist enough, that the roots kept working, even as the surface baked. She still lost part of one field entirely, forced to replant a section that had gone too far to save. Money was tight enough that fall that she skipped repairs on a piece of equipment rather than fall further behind. For a few weeks, watching the losses add up, she wondered if she'd been fooling herself the whole time. Then the harvest numbers came in from the treated ground, and they told a different story than the fear had. By early autumn of the third year, Margaret walked out to the same spot behind the old hay shed where she'd first knelt down years before. The fence line looked the same, but the field beyond it did not. Where the ground had once cracked in dry seams under a July sun, it now held together, dark and soft, crumbling in her palm like something alive instead of something dead. Rain that used to pool uselessly on the surface now disappeared into the earth within minutes. The corn stood thick and even, the leaves holding their color instead of curling by mid-afternoon. It wasn't a perfect field. There were still thin patches, still spots that needed more seasons of work. But it was, unmistakably, a field coming back to life, instead of one being slowly used up. Wallace came by that October, the way he did most years, to look over the harvest and talk yields the way farmers do. He stopped his truck at the edge of the field Margaret had started with, got out, and walked into it without being asked. He knelt down. He didn't say anything for a moment. He pressed his fingers into the soil, squeezed it, watched it crumble apart, instead of staying packed in a hard clump, the way his own worst ground did. "How fast did that rain go in?" he asked, nodding toward a puddle from the storm 2 days earlier, already gone from most of the field. "Faster than it used to," Margaret said. He stood up, brushing the dirt from his knees. "What'd you do differently?" She could have told him it was the hay. That would have been the easy answer, and not entirely wrong. But it wasn't the whole truth, and she'd learned enough by then to know the difference mattered. "The hay was never the answer by itself," she said. "It was patience, watching what the ground was actually telling me instead of what I expected it to say. Fixing what didn't work instead of walking away from it. Feeding the soil back for once, instead of just taking from it every year and hoping it would keep giving." Wallace didn't apologize, not in so many words. He just nodded, the kind of quiet nod one working farmer gives another when respect has replaced doubt. The story of Margaret's farm was never really about rotten hay. It was about the things people overlook because they don't look valuable on the surface. Old knowledge, patient work, the discarded pile nobody wants that turns out to hold more promise than anyone expected. It was about the difference between farming that keeps taking and farming that gives something back. It was about a woman who refused to accept that tired, degraded ground had to stay that way forever. She didn't fix her whole farm in 3 years. She still has fields that need more seasons of work, more mistakes to learn from, more mornings walking the property with her notebook in her pocket. But standing in that field in October, with the smell of cool-turned earth around her and the light going long and gold across the pasture, Margaret Doyle picked up a handful of soil and let it run slowly through her fingers. She thought about those trucks pulling down the lane that first morning and how strange it must have looked from the road. A woman paying good money for hay nobody else wanted. She wasn't just saving hay that everyone else had thrown away. She was rebuilding the ground underneath everything else she'd ever grow, and the land, given enough patience, had finally started listening back. Have you ever saved something everyone else considered useless, and had it turn into something worth more than anyone expected? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever stood in Margaret's shoes, staring at tired ground and wondering if it could ever come back. If this story meant something to you, hit like, subscribe to the Farmland Files, and share it with someone who still believes in giving the land back what it's owed.